Hello, and welcome to the ACR Journals on Air podcast. It's a pleasure to be back on the air. I'm your host, Vicky Shanmugam. Before we start our discussion today, I wanted to say a huge heartfelt thank you to Dr. Bharat Kumar, who sat in for me for the last few months. I'm incredibly grateful for his dedication to keeping the podcast going. I enjoyed listening to his deep dives into the pool of rheumatology science, and I can only hope that I'm not too rusty coming back behind the microphone. So we're going to get right back into the saddle, though, with a class project. The manuscript we will discuss today is Clinical Characteristics of Antisynthetase Syndrome, Analysis from the Classification Criteria for Antisynthetase Syndrome Project, class project. It was published in Arthritis and Rheumatology, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes from today. I'm excited to be joined by some of the class investigators, and I dare say classy authors, Dr. Sara Khashani, Dr. Akira Yoshida, and Dr. Giovanni Zanframundo. Dr. Khashani was born and raised in Iran. She studied medicine at Tehran University of Medical Sciences, and then for several years was at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences at the National Institute of Health, where she served for several years on NIEHS protocols, contributing to the development and implementation of research studies aimed at advancing the understanding of inflammatory myopathies. She subsequently completed her internal medicine residency at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and rheumatology fellowship at Stanford University. She's now a clinical informatics fellow at the University of California, San Francisco, where she's learning to leverage technology and informatics to improve the care of people with rheumatic diseases. Dr. Akira Yoshida is a rheumatologist and postgraduate student at the Nippon Medical School, Graduate School of Medicine in Tokyo, Japan. He completed his medical degree at Tokyo Medical Dental University School of Medicine in Tokyo, and then completed internal medicine residency and rheumatology training at the Kamida Medical Center in Chiba, Japan. He's a member of the Japan College of Rheumatology and a fellow of the Japanese Society of Internal Medicine. And finally, Dr. Giovanni Zanframundo is a consultant rheumatologist and assistant professor in the Department of Internal Medicine and Therapeutics at the University of Pavia in Pavia, Italy. He completed his medical degree at the University of Rome and trained in rheumatology at the University of Pavia. He also received his PhD in experimental medicine from the University of Pavia in 2022. Welcome to the show, Sara, Akira, and Giovanni.
Thank you, Dr. Shanmugam. It's a real honor to be here. I've listened to ACR Journals on Air for years, so having the opportunity to join as a guest to discuss our work is incredibly exciting.
Thank you very much for having us today. I'm also a big fan of ACR Journal on Air, and I'm so excited to be here. It truly is like a dream come true.
Hello to all colleagues and listeners, and thank you for having us today. It's a great honor for me to be here and really looking forward to discussing our work together.
So, Sara, since you're the first author, I'm going to start the discussion with you. Can you tell our listeners, why was this study needed?
This study was needed because antisynthetase syndrome, or ASyS, remains a clinically recognized but poorly defined entity. Despite decades of research and clear recognition by experts, we still lack formal data-driven or consensus-based classification criteria. This has created challenges in standardizing patient identification for research studies and clinical trials, often leading to inconsistent inclusion criteria and difficulty comparing outcomes across cohorts. Our manuscript represents a foundational step in addressing this gap. Specifically, it describes the data-driven arm of the larger class project, the classification criteria for antisynthetase syndrome. The broader class initiative includes both data-driven and expert consensus components, and this publication focuses on systematically characterizing the clinical and serologic features of ASyS across a large international cohort. By doing so, we aim to inform future efforts to develop robust, validated classification criteria that will facilitate research, improve diagnostic accuracy, and ultimately enhance patient care.
So tell our listeners a little bit more background about the class project. What is it, who funds it, and who got it all started?
The class project which stands for Classification Criteria for Anti-Synthetase Syndrome, is an international investigator-led collaboration that was initiated by Dr. Rohit Agarwal and Dr. Lorenzo Cavagna. The project is supported by grants from both the American College of Rheumatology, ACR, and the European Alliance of Associations for Rheumatology, EULAR, and it brings together a global network of clinicians and researchers who share a common goal to develop a validated classification criteria for anti-synthetase syndrome. The timeline of the CLASS project began in mid-2018, following the approval of our funding from ACR and EULAR. We first focused on identifying and recruiting centers and investigators across the world who treat patients with ASyS or closely mimicking systemic autoimmune rheumatic diseases. A multidisciplinary steering committee was then formed, composed of international experts in ASyS, including rheumatologists, pulmonologists, neurologists, and dermatologists. We began by conducting a systematic literature review to identify the most relevant clinical and serologic features of ASyS. These informed the development of a comprehensive REDCap questionnaire used for standardized data collection across participating sites. Like many global efforts, our timeline was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which introduced delays in data entry and sample collection. Nevertheless, we were able to gather serum samples, verify the integrity of the data, and centrally analyze both the clinical data and biospecimens. The study we are discussing today represents one of the key outputs of that extensive and collaborative process.
So you talk about collaboration. How many investigators are involved and how many sites are recruiting patients for this study?
This has been a huge international effort. We currently have over 300 investigators from more than 90 centers across 30 countries in North America, Europe, Asia, South America, and Australia. The broad geographic representation has really strengthened the project by allowing us to include diverse patient population and regional practice patterns.
I feel quite a bit of empathy for the people coordinating your Zoom calls. Tell us how many patients have been enrolled and how did you select the specific patients that you analyzed in this particular manuscript?
At the time of the analysis for this manuscript, 2,035 patients with anti-synthetase syndrome and 2,140 patients with mimicking controlled diseases have been enrolled in the CLASS database. Our team reviewed all patients' data to verify the diagnosis. For this manuscript, we randomly selected a subset of nearly 950 patients with anti-synthetase syndrome and over 1,000 disease controls. This was about 50% of the verified population. We used the remaining 50% for the validation analysis.
Okay, so in figure 1 of your manuscript, you've got a really nice breakdown of the different domains you studied in these patients. Would you mind just describing it for our listeners?
Of course. In figure 1, we organize clinical and laboratory variables into predefined domains: joints, lungs, muscle, skin, cardiac, other clinical features, and serologies. Each domain contained variables we hypothesized to be important for ASyS diagnosis, such as mechanic hands in the skin domain, arthritis in the joint domain, or muscle enzyme elevation in the muscle domain. This structure allowed us to explore patterns of association both within and across clinical systems.
Okay, so I'm going to switch over now to Akira. And Akira, tell us a little bit more about the antibodies. We all know there's an alphabet soup of anti-synthetase antibodies. Can you tell us what they are? And what is it that the immune system is actually reacting to?
Yes, absolutely. So antisynthetase syndrome, ASyS, is characterized by the presence of autoantibodies targeting amino acid tRNA synthetase, ARS. ARS catalyzes the ATP-dependent reaction of single amino acid attachment to its specific tRNA and ensures the proper protein synthesis. Along with this main function, ARS also participates in immune system activation as antigens or extracellular signals, regulating the proliferation and migration of various immune cells. Although there are 20 areas that correspond to each amino acid, autoantibodies against 8 of them have been well described in the context of ACEs, with the anti-histidar tRNA synthetase, anti-Jo1, being the most common. The other 7 anti-RS autoantibodies include anti-PL7, PL12, EJ, OJ, KS, ZO, and HA autoantibodies. However, recently several autoantibodies targeting other ARS, such as anti-Li autoantibodies, have also been reported in patients with ACEs.
Yeah, so more keep being described. In a worldwide study, I assume you had many different labs running these antibodies. As a practical matter, is there any nuance to this testing? And I don't know whether I dare ask this, but are there some labs that are better at running these tests? Did all the patients get tested for all the antibodies, or did you do these research labs after the patient was diagnosed?
Thank you for bringing up such an important issue. The target of anti-Jo1 antibodies was identified as histidar tRNA synthetase by a method called immunoprecipitation, IP, in 1983. And since then, IP has been the gold standard for the detection of myositis-specific autoantibodies, including anti-ARS autoantibodies. IP has high sensitivity and specificity. However, it is confined to some specialized centers and used mainly for research, as it is labor intensive and the reading of precipitation bands requires a high level of expertise. So in clinical practice, commercial immunoassays such as ELISA or line blot immunoassays are more commonly used, which allows more rapid assessment of myositis autoantibodies at a lower cost in a more accessible manner. In the dataset analyzed in this manuscript, only 14% of patients with ACEs were tested for myositis autoantibodies by IP in local centers. However, we must bear in mind that commercial assays could be associated with a high rate of false positivity and false negativity, especially for non-Jo1 anti-ARS autoantibodies, as we reported in another manuscript published by the PLUS project last year.
Giovanni, I want to flip over to some of the skin manifestations. Would you mind giving us a tutorial on the rashes that you included in the skin domain for these patients? Everyone's heard of mechanics' hands, but what about hikers' feet?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to walk you through it. So, first of all, it's worth mentioning that up to 20% of ACEs patients can show rashes that are typical of dermatomyositis. And in fact, also in our dataset, we found that about 1 in 4 patients had Gottron papules, 1 in 5 had a heliotrope rash, and 1 in 7 had the V sign. So this kind of rash, it's definitely part of the clinical picture of ACEs. The thing is that in our analysis, these inflammatory rashes were negatively associated with ACEs. We hypothesized that it's because many of the control had dermatomyositis, where these skin signs are actually even more common. So while these rashes are part of the picture of ACEs, they are not specific enough to be distinguishing features, at least from a statistical standpoint. Now, the story is quite different when we talk about mechanic sense, which are much more specific to ACEs. They refer to changes where the skin becomes thick, rough, and cracked, mostly on the outer side of the index and the middle finger and the inner side of the thumb, where you may also see deep fissures. Mechanic sense also have a foot equivalent, which is known as hiker's feet, first described in 2017. These are similar lesions that involve the heels, the plantar arch, or even the toes. They are less recognized, but they can actually show up even before mechanic sense. So they can be a really useful clue, especially in the early disease.
And in this data, were hikers' feet associated with antisynthetase syndrome?
You see, our data were collected retrospectively. And as I mentioned before, hiker's feet are not something most clinicians specifically look for. So they were only reported in a small number of cases and controls. And that's why we grouped them together with mechanic sense for the purpose of our analysis. And together, mechanic sense and Hiker's fit were actually very strong indicators of ACEs with an odds ratio of 8.5. Of course,
So
yeah,
always take the shoes and socks off is the lesson learned.
yes. Of course, in the clinical practice, you always need to rule out things like patients having frequent hiking or doing certain manual jobs. But if those things don't apply, you're already thinking about ACEs, these skin lesions can really be helpful in pointing you in the right direction.
Fabulous. And I was a little surprised by some of the findings regarding the muscle domain. Can you unpack that for our listeners?
Absolutely. We were surprised too, because when we looked at the muscle domain, what really stood out as a predictor of ASIS was not the muscle weakness, but rather muscle pain and elevated muscle enzymes. Now, it's important to remember that not all patients with ASIS actually develop muscle weakness. This is something we've learned from large cohorts like Pittsburgh and Aeneas cohorts, where up to a quarter of patients were myopathic, meaning no muscle weakness at all, even after years of follow up. Additionally, in our data set, data on EMG, muscle MRI, and muscle biopsy were quite limited for patients with ASIS. These tests were much more frequently performed in controls, such as patients with dermatomyositis. And we believe that this reflects clinical practice, where anti-ARS antibodies often provide a strong diagnostic clue so that clinicians may feel less need for further invasive investigations. And as a result, in our analysis, this test did not significantly contribute to distinguish ACEs from control. That said, in subgroup analysis, especially those with joint and lung involvement, we did see that muscle involvement was more clearly associated with ACEs. So muscle involvement is definitely a relevant feature for ACEs and for its future classification criteria.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And another kind of important clinical tip is pain is common, and we are often taught in medical school that's not the case, but it is the case. So, very helpful. Sarah, I'm going to pull you back in now. Lung involvement is one of the most dreaded complications of myositis. What did you find about lung involvement in your data?
That's a great question. Interstitial lung disease, or ILD, is one of the most serious manifestations of anti-synthetase syndrome, often driving morbidity and mortality. In our cohort, ILD was present in approximately 81% of patients with ASyS. This high prevalence reinforces how central ILD is to the syndrome's clinical picture. What we found particularly striking was that ILD was not only common, but also highly discriminatory. In our multivariable analysis, including models both with and without serological data, ILD remained one of the most heavily weighted variables for predicting an ASyS diagnosis. That's important because it highlights ILD not just as a comorbidity, but as a core feature of the disease that can significantly aid in classification. We also explored radiologic subtypes. The NSIP and or OP pattern was the most frequently observed and had a strong association with ASyS, as previously described. But we also noted that even the UIP pattern, which is typically thought to be more characteristic of other forms of ILD, was significantly associated with ASyS in our data. So while less common, UIP shouldn't be overlooked when considering an ASyS diagnosis.
It's another really important clinical tip, I feel. And Akira, what did the antibody analysis show?
Yes, so as expected, the presence of anti-Jo1 or non-Jo1 anti-ARS autoantibodies was strongly associated with ASyS diagnosis, regardless of whether the testing method was IT or non-IT. This indicates that local diagnostic practices of ASyS relies heavily on anti-ARS autoantibody testings. Meanwhile, other autoantibodies such as anti-nuclear antibodies, ANA, with cytoplasmic pattern, and anti-Ro52 or SSA autoantibodies were also associated with ACEs diagnosis. We think this highlights the potential utility of these autoantibodies in the classification criteria for ACEs, particularly in the settings where access to non-Jo1 anti-RS autoantibody detection is limited, and when the precision of commercial immunoassays such as line blot immunoassay remains uncertain, and we cannot exclude the possibility of ACEs just by the negativity of anti-RS autoantibodies by these commercial assays.
Yeah, that's really useful too. And I think kind of makes this very globally relevant. You did also do some subgroup analysis and multivariate analysis. What did that show?
Yeah, thank you for bringing these up. We perform subgroup analysis to better understand the association between certain clinical or serological variables and the diagnosis of ACEs in patients with a specific organ involvement. For instance, to evaluate the performance of inflammatory rashes in discriminating ACEs among patients with ILD, we analyzed the association of inflammatory rashes with ACEs in the lung cohort, which comprised cases and controls with ILD. We would like to highlight that muscle weakness, which was not associated with ACEs in the entire cohort, did show an association with ACEs in the subgroups focusing on joint or lung involvement. Meanwhile, inflammatory rashes did not show an association with ACEs even in subgroups focusing on joint, lung, or muscle involvement. And we finally performed multivariable ridge regression analysis to estimate the weight of each clinical or serological variable for ACEs diagnosis prediction. We ran two separate multivariable models with and without anti-ARS autoantibodies, considering that their strong association with ACEs diagnosis could overshadow the effect of other variables. In the models with anti-ARS autoantibodies, the highest weight was provided for anti-ARS autoantibody as expected, followed by mechanics hands, hiker speeds, ILD, ANAs with cytoplasmic pattern, muscle enzyme elevation, anti-Ro or SSA antibodies, arthritis, and fever. In the model without anti-ARS autoantibodies, the weight for each variable increased substantially, which also identified Raynaud phenomenon as another variable with a significant weight.
Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of hear this data described because as a clinician, it really strikes me that what you're trying to do is from the multitude of data that we see in the clinic, hone down what are the crucial things that really matter in confirming or refuting a diagnosis of antisynthetase syndrome, kind of making me think that eventually maybe you will allow the machine learning to take over from the expert diagnostician in this field.
That is a great point, Vicky. As you mentioned, I am doing a clinical training in informatics, and we have been using machine learning and nowadays more of generative AI to try to help us uh, by enhancing early detection of patients with rare diseases. And one of the first steps to take is to use data-driven models. And we need good data because I'm sure, as you have heard, that if you do not have good data, the output would not be reliable.
Yeah. And just kind of hearing this entire global project described, I feel this is a wonderful and rich data set. I'm sure you're going to be mining it for years to come.
That is the plan. Yes.
So I thought it might be fun as we're wrapping up to do a little bit of a three-way lightning round with all three of you on the podcast today. I'm going to ask the next set of questions to each of you in turn. So we'll go Sarah, Akira, and then Giovanni. So starting up, this has obviously been a lengthy undertaking that you've all been involved with for a long time. What's the next most important question that you'd each like to answer with the class project?
That is a great question, Vicky. Our main goal is to develop classification criteria for antisynthetase syndrome. Our team is interested to learn more about ACEs, and we are interested to leverage the amazing data set, as you mentioned, that we have to answer some questions, such as how does the disease evolve over time? We are particularly interested in disease trajectories. Who develops progression of ILD? Who relapses? And what predicts long-term outcomes? I think Class Project is uniquely positioned to help answer those questions with future longitudinal work.
And Akira.
Thank you. So I agree with Sarah. The strength of the CLASS project is that we have the largest, as far as we know, international multi-center database of ACEs and mimicking conditions. Now that we come up with the first data and consensus-driven classification criteria for ACEs, I think our next step is a deep dive into the distinct but heterogeneous clinical phenotype of ACEs. So we have conducted actually several sub-analyses, including a supervised cluster analysis in the class database and some other analysis focusing on ILD or cardiac involvement in ACEs. And we have presented the data already in ACR convergence last year. So hopefully these will come out as manuscripts soon.
And Giovanni, what's your focus?
Well, I completely agree with Sarah and Akira. And of course, the most important outcome we are all expecting from the CLASS project is the development of classification criteria for antisynthetase syndrome. That alone will open up so many opportunities for research and clinical trials. But if I had to pick the next most important question, it would be whether there are any factors present at the time of diagnosis that can help predict how the disease will evolve. This kind of work has already been done for patients with anti-Jo1 autoantibodies, but it hasn't yet been extended to other anti-synthetase antibodies. And I think this would be a really important next step.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, to the three of you, if you had your time over and could go back to 2018, which I know many of us really wish we could do, is there anything you'd have done differently in the design phase of setting up this study when you were putting it together?
That's a great question. And they say hindsight is 2020. In retrospect, I would have prioritized collecting more robust follow-up data from the start. When we designed this study, our focus was on obtaining information that would help us analyze the data for the development of the classification project. And although our dataset is rich cross-sectionally, longitudinal information, such as relapse rates or response to therapy, is limited. Having that would be incredibly valuable for studying disease progression and treatment impact.
For sure. Kira.
Yeah, thank you. This is such an interesting question. And I completely agree with Sarah's point. As I mentioned earlier, we believe that the CLASS project is one of the largest datasets, including more than 2,000 ACEs and its mimickers. And I think this is a great asset where we have the potential to investigate not only the clinical phenotype, but also the disease trajectory of ACEs, including survival, relapse, and LD progression, as well as risk factors for those outcomes. I would say the class database is largely cross-sectional right now and it has limitations when it comes to follow-up data due to high rate of missingness and insufficient follow-up periods in some cases. I'm not sure if this is feasible or not, but it would be great if we have a chance to collaborate with local investigators to collect additional follow-up data.
And Giovanni?
Yeah, well, once again, I agree with Sarah and Akira. And if I had to add one thing that I would have done differently, it would probably be to collect more detailed data on the intensity of antibody positivity, especially for patients tested with Lyme blot assays. I think that this would have allowed us to explore some really valuable insights that we simply could not explore with the data we had. But, when we first started, we honestly didn't expect to end up with such a larger data set. The project was originally designed to be about 10 times smaller in terms of data. So we couldn't anticipate having the statistical power to go that far. Looking back, this is definitely something I would include if I had the chance to start over.
That's so nice to hear. And I am never cease to be amazed by the myositis community and how well the community of rheumatologists and pulmonologists and dermatologists studying myositis come together to really improve care and outcomes for people with myositis. It's truly a force of nature.
Thank you for mentioning that, Vicky. We are very grateful for all the international groups supportive of treating and helping patients with idiopathic inflammatory myopathies, anti-synthetase syndrome, and other rheumatic diseases. And without support of these groups, we wouldn't be able to do this research. And that is why one of the important features that we have considered in the development of the main classification project is to make sure we will have representatives from the patient community with anti-synthetase syndrome to learn about our results before getting the final consensus.
Yeah. No, and it's so important to engage with the lived experience for sure. I'm going to ask this next question again to each of you. You're all early career investigators. What has been the most significant lesson each of you's learned from participating in the class project?
I have learned a lot, and this is difficult to select one, but if I had to, the most significant lesson has been the power of global collaboration. Coordinating efforts across time zones, languages, and healthcare system is no small feat, but it's incredibly rewarding. I've also learned how essential it is to combine a structured data collection with clinical insight, especially for rare and heterogeneous diseases like anti-synthetase syndrome. Working with this team has shown me how much we can accomplish when we bring together diverse perspective with a shared mission. I also want to take a moment to thank the many individuals who have made this effort possible, from the participating centers and investigator that generously contributed data and cases, to the steering committee who guided the project every step of the way. A special thanks goes to the class core team for their tireless work behind the scenes, and to our colleagues who managed the technical challenges, including the coordination of international serum sample shipments and central laboratory testing. This project truly reflects a remarkable collective effort.
I agree. Akira, what was your lesson learned?
Yeah, I totally agree with Sarah. And I myself joined the class project later as a support team member 3 years ago. And at that time, I would say I was a typical Japanese PhD student. I was not familiar with discussion in English. And I remember I was even scared of meetings, to be honest. And I was really fortunate to become a member of this class project. I would say the class family. I want to highlight that most of us are from non-English speaking countries, and our meetings provide an open environment that allows anyone in the team to speak up without fear of making mistakes, which actually really improved my communication skills. And I also learned a lot from Sarah, Giovanni, and of course from our two great PIs, Professors Rohita Garwal and Renzo Cavagna, in terms of how to manage this kind of large international collaborative efforts.
Yeah, really wonderful to hear that. And Giovanni, what was your important lesson?
Well, I definitely learned a lot about anti-synthetase syndrome itself, which is, of course, the core of what we're trying to share through our work. But honestly, also for me, the most meaningful lesson was to realize how enriching it can be to collaborate openly with colleagues. I had the chance to know a lot of brilliant people in the course of the project, who then became people I now admire, and some of them became friends. And this is the thing I am most grateful for.
Yeah, I love hearing these stories. It's so wonderful to hear about this international collaboration and the power of what you were able to do by working together and kind of breaking down silos. So I want to just thank you again, all three of you, for this fabulous discussion. It really was a pleasure to hear your insights, and the class project sounds like a real class act. So I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Vicky. It's been a pleasure to discuss our work and share the class project with a broader audience. We're excited about the next steps and deeply grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with so many dedicated investigators around the world.
Thank you very much for having us today and providing this wonderful opportunity to present our data from the CLASS project.
Yes, thank you, Vicky. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where the next step of the CLASS project will take us.
So I want to close today by thanking all of the other 347 CLASS investigators for participating in this project and the many, many patients who were involved. I can only imagine how arduous the Zoom calls were and the coordination of this effort. And I think the rheumatology and other autoimmune disease community will be so very grateful. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow at ACR Room on social media, email us at podcast@rheumatology.org, and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.